He said guilty 7 times. Not in a single statement. Not in a confession read aloud by a lawyer while he sat expressionless at the defense table. He said it himself, in his own voice, one word at a time, in response to each name, as the district attorney of Suffolk County stood before him in a packed courtroom in Riverhead, New York, and read the charges aloud. The prosecutor's voice was steady and measured, moving through the names with the deliberate cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times over, who had imagined it, perhaps, through the years of investigation, through the false leads and the cold trails and the families calling and the press conferences where there was nothing new to say. Melissa Barthelemy, guilty. Megan Waterman, guilty. Amber Costello, guilty. Maureen Brainard-Barnes, guilty. Jessica Taylor, guilty. Sandra Costilla, guilty. Valerie Mack, guilty. 7 times. The words spoken by the defendant himself, not entered by counsel, not stipulated in a written agreement, spoken aloud, in a room packed with reporters and law enforcement, and, in the gallery behind the bar, the families. The people who had lost someone. The people who had waited. Some of them for more than 2 decades. Some of them since the early 2000s, when a daughter or a sister went missing, and the official response was slower than it should have been, and the years piled up, and the investigation moved forward, and then seemed to stall, and then moved again, and then stalled again. And then, as the formal charges were exhausted and the 7 formal pleas entered into the record, Rex Heuermann admitted to something he had not been charged with, the killing of an 8th woman, Karen Vergata, whose remains were found on Fire Island in 1996, whose case had been open for 30 years, who had been known for most of those 30 years, not by her name but by a designation, Fire Island Jane Doe, because her identity had not been established until much more recently. He had not been charged with her death. He admitted it voluntarily, as part of a plea agreement that gave him something specific in return. No further charges would be pressed in connection with these 8 murders, whatever the investigation might eventually establish. 8 women. A killing spree that spanned 17 years, from 1993, when Sandra Costilla became the first, to 2010, when Amber Lynn Costello became the last. One word, said 8 times, in a courtroom that held everyone who had a stake in this moment. The families of the dead, the investigators who had built the case, the journalists who had covered it, the prosecutors who had spent years preparing for a trial that never happened because the defendant decided finally that the math no longer worked in his favor. 8 women, one word, 30 years of waiting. Rex Heuermann, 62 years old at the time of his guilty plea, an architect, not a career criminal, not someone with a documented prior history of violence, not someone who appeared, on the surface of things, to be capable of what he admitted in that courtroom. He was born and raised on Long Island. He attended New York Institute of Technology, where he studied architecture. He built a professional career that spanned decades, working at his own firm in Midtown Manhattan, RH Consultants and Associates, a firm that worked on commercial and residential projects across the New York metropolitan area. He commuted from Massapequa Park, Long Island, the way millions of New Yorkers commute. He was on the Lear or on the Meadowbrook Parkway, or on whichever route he took on whatever morning, surrounded by other commuters heading into the city for another ordinary workday. He had a wife, he had children, he had a house on 2nd Avenue in Massapequa Park, a suburban house with a garage, a yard, the physical trappings of a life that looked, from the outside, entirely normal. He also had, in that garage and elsewhere in the house, materials and tools that would later become evidence. He had, in his online history, searches that would later become evidence. He had, across 17 years, the specific knowledge of geography and method and victim selection that would later become the framework of a prosecution. But none of that was visible to the neighbors, or to the colleagues he worked alongside in Midtown, or to the commuters who sat next to him on the train. The man who was hiding in plain sight was not hiding in any way that plain sight could detect. That is the first lesson of this case, and we will return to it. The architecture of concealment that Rex Heuermann built and maintained was not primarily physical. It was social. It was the architecture of ordinary life deployed as camouflage. The commute, the profession, the suburban address, the family, the unremarkable daily existence that gave anyone who encountered him no reason to look closer. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we are going to tell the full story of the Gilgo Beach killings, from the first murder in 1993 to the guilty plea on April 8, 2026. We are going to tell it in full, which means telling it about the women first. Not as victims in the abstract, but as specific people with specific lives and specific stories. We are going to explain the forensic case in detail, the pizza crust, the DNA match, the surveillance operation, the vehicle registration database entry that unraveled 30 years of concealment. We are going to address the institutional failures directly, the corruption under Burke and Spoda, what it meant, and what it might have cost. And we are going to address what remains unresolved, the additional potential victims, the cooperation agreement with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, and what June 17th, the sentencing date, will mean for the families who have been waiting. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This case is one of the most documented and most followed in modern American true crime history. Netflix released the documentary series Gone Girls specifically about it, featuring interviews with investigators and family members and footage from throughout the investigation. A Hollywood film called Lost Girls was made about the victims in 2020, based on the book by Robert Kolker. The guilty plea last week generated national coverage in every major outlet. And the questions it leaves open, about additional potential victims, about the institutional failures that prolonged this case for 12 years, about what Heuermann has now agreed to tell the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, mean this story is not finished. Subscribe so you are here for what comes next. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Not 2010, the actual beginning. November 1993, Southampton, New York, the Hamptons, an area known to most Americans as the summer playground of the wealthy, the stretch of Long Island's East End where Manhattan money comes to decompress in July and August. In November, the Hamptons are emptier, the beaches quieter, the summer visitors long gone. It was November 1993 when a woman named Sandra Costilla was killed by Rex Heuermann, and her remains were left in Southampton, more than 60 miles east of Gilgo Beach, in a location that would not be connected to the Ocean Parkway cluster for nearly 30 years. Sandra Costilla was in her late 20s. She had a life. She had people who knew her. And she disappeared in 1993 and was reported missing. And then, as would happen with so many of the women who came after her, the official response was inadequate, and the years passed, and the case went cold, and the connection to what would eventually be identified as a serial killer operating across Long Island was not made until decades later. Heuermann killed her first. She was the beginning, and she was found last, in the sense that her connection to the Gilgo Beach cluster was established last. Her link to the man now serving life in prison for her death was confirmed last. Her name was attached to charges last. First to die, last to be connected. Sandra Costilla deserves to be named first. 3 years later, in 1996, Karen Vergata disappeared. She was in her 30s. Her remains were found on Fire Island in 1996. For years, those remains were unidentified. A set of Jane Doe remains in the file, connected to nothing, waiting for the technology and the investigative resources and the specific chain of events that would eventually establish who she was and who had killed her. She was Fire Island Jane Doe for decades. She became Karen Vergata, confirmed, much later. She became the 8th admission in Rex Heuermann's guilty plea in 2026. She had been gone for 30 years by the time the man who killed her said guilty in a courtroom in Riverhead. Then came the long middle, the period between 1993 and 2007 during which Heuermann killed. The exact number during this period is not publicly established, and the cooperation agreement with the FBI may eventually illuminate what happened during those years, and the period from 2007 to 2010, during which the 4 women known as the Gilgo Four disappeared in rapid succession. Maureen Brainard-Barnes disappeared in July 2007. She was 25 years old. She was from Norwich, Connecticut. She had a young son. She was working in New York City when she was reported missing. Her family filed a missing persons report. The response was not what a family filing a missing persons report for a young mother deserves. She was reported missing. The case was opened. Time passed. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009. She was 24 years old. She was from the Buffalo area of upstate New York and had moved to New York City. Her family reported her missing. The case was opened. And then, in the days after her death, something happened that sets the Barthelemy case apart from the others in a way that is deeply disturbing. Heuermann made phone calls to Melissa Barthelemy's younger sister, her teenage sister, from a burner phone. He described what he had done to Melissa, in detail, to a teenager who was trying to find her missing sister. When this detail became public after Heuermann's arrest in 2023, it defined, for many people who had been following the case, exactly what kind of person they were dealing with. Not merely someone who killed, someone who called the families afterward. Someone for whom the killing was not the end of the act, but the beginning of something else. A performance, an assertion of power, a compulsion that extended beyond the crime itself into the suffering of the people who were left behind. Investigators later determined that the calls to Barthelemy's sister were made on a burner phone from Heuermann's neighborhood and from locations Heuermann had been documented traveling to. The calls became evidence. The calls became part of the case. Megan Waterman disappeared in June 2010. She was 22 years old. She was from Scarborough, Maine. She had a young daughter. She had traveled to Long Island for work and was reported missing. Her mother, Lorraine Ela, would spend the years that followed advocating publicly for Megan, for the other victims, for the families of the women who had been found along Ocean Parkway. She was in the courtroom on April 8th when Heuermann said the word. Amber Lynn Costello disappeared in September 2010. She was 27 years old. She was from Bayshore, Long Island. She was reported missing, and a witness in the area around the time of her disappearance reported seeing a pickup truck. That detail, a truck, a description, a database query 12 years later, was the thread that eventually unraveled everything. All four of them, Brainard-Barnes, Barthelemy, Waterman, Costello, were found in December 2010 in the brush along Ocean Parkway at Gilgo Beach, found together in the sense that the same search recovered all four sets of remains in close proximity within a short period of time, wrapped in burlap, heads and legs bound. Disposed of along a beach highway that Heuermann had been 25 minutes from his home in Massapequa Park, a man who knew the geography of that barrier island in the way someone knows the geography of a place they have driven past regularly for years. The discovery of the four sets of remains at Gilgo Beach in December 2010 triggered one of the largest law enforcement responses in Long Island history, not because a serial killer had been identified, but because four sets of human remains had been found in a concentrated area with consistent physical characteristics, the burlap, the binding, that made it immediately clear to any experienced investigator that they were looking at the work of a single individual. A single individual who had been operating in this geography, who knew this highway, who had used this location not once but at least 4 times. The search was expanded, and more remains were found. Jessica Taylor, whose remains had been found in 2 locations, at Manorville in 2003, and additional remains at Gilgo Beach in 2011. Valerie Mack, whose remains had similarly been found at Manorville in 2000 and additional remains at Gilgo Beach in 2011. The geographic spread was confusing and significant simultaneously, the same perpetrator operating across a wider area than the Gilgo Beach cluster alone suggested, over a longer timeline than the 2007 to 2010 window of the Gilgo Four. And then Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance had triggered the original search, whose remains were found in a marshy area near Oak Beach in December 2011. Not at Gilgo Beach, not wrapped in burlap, in a location that the medical examiner ruled consistent with accidental drowning rather than homicide. Shannon Gilbert's case is separate, officially unresolved, and we will return to it. Now let's talk about who Rex Heuermann was and is, because the biographical picture matters not just as background to the crimes, but as an illustration of how predators of this type function in the world. Rex Heuermann grew up in Manorville, Long Island, one of the locations where victims' remains were found. He attended New York Institute of Technology, graduating with a degree in architecture. He went to work at various firms before establishing his own practice, RH Consultants and Associates in Midtown Manhattan. He worked in an office on 7th Avenue. He was known to colleagues as competent, capable, someone with genuine professional skill. He won projects. He delivered work. He was, by the standards of his professional environment, a functioning and reasonably successful architect. He was also, by the profile that investigators and psychologists have constructed from the evidence and from what he has admitted, someone who had been living with violent compulsions for decades. Investigators found in his home and on his devices a blueprint, a document later described in court as a blueprint for crimes, that detailed his methods and his thinking. They found extensive collections of material that spoke to his psychology. They found evidence that the life he had built, the professional career, the suburban home, the family, had been maintained in parallel with, and as concealment for, a pattern of violence that began in 1993 and continued for 17 years. That parallel existence, the architect commuting to Manhattan, the killer returning to Long Island with the knowledge of what he had done, is not unique in the literature of serial predation. Investigators and behavioral scientists have documented numerous cases in which individuals functioning apparently normally in professional and domestic environments were simultaneously committing violent crimes that their environments gave no indication of. Ted Bundy worked at a suicide hotline. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, was a church president. John Wayne Gacy ran a construction company. The capacity to maintain two entirely different selves, one visible to the world and one invisible, is a documented feature of this specific type of offender. What investigators would later describe as Heuermann's method had several consistent elements. He used burner phones, prepaid devices purchased to avoid creating a traceable connection between his real identity and the communications he needed to make before the crimes. He contacted victims through their online advertisements, offering money, establishing meetings. He was organized and deliberate. The burlap, the binding, the specific disposal site along Ocean Parkway that he returned to multiple times suggested someone who had thought through logistics carefully rather than someone acting impulsively. He monitored the investigation into his own crimes, which investigators found documented in his internet search history. He attended community meetings about the Gilgo Beach murders. There is documented evidence of his presence at public forums where investigators and officials were discussing the case. He sat in those rooms and listened. That detail deserves a moment of attention. Rex Heuermann went to community meetings about the Gilgo Beach murders. He sat in rooms with law enforcement officials and community members and journalists who were discussing his crimes. He listened to what investigators were saying publicly about the case, what they knew and what they didn't, what leads they were pursuing and which had gone cold. And he continued to live in Massapequa Park, 25 minutes from the disposal site, commuting to Midtown every day for 12 years after the remains were found, for 10 years after the investigation had become a national story. He believed he was safe. He had reasons to believe that. The investigation was stalling. The institutional environment around it was, as we will discuss, not functioning the way it should have been. The victims he had chosen were women whose disappearances had not generated the kind of sustained investigative urgency that he believed would eventually reach him. He had been careful. He had been organized. He had been hiding in a suburb 25 minutes from the crime scene for years. He was wrong. But it took 12 years of the investigation going nowhere for the conditions to change. Now let's talk about why it took 12 years. Because this is where the story of Rex Heuermann becomes also the story of James Burke and Thomas Spota, and what it means when the institutions responsible for solving crimes are themselves corrupted. James Burke became the chief of the Suffolk County Police Department in 2012. He was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, a commanding and intimidating figure. Someone who had risen through the department's ranks and who had powerful political and institutional allies. His relationship with Thomas Spota, who had been the Suffolk County District Attorney since 2002, was close and mutually reinforcing. Spota had been Burke's mentor in many respects. Burke's career had been shaped, in part, by Spota's patronage and support. The criminal conduct that brought them both down began, according to the federal investigation that eventually exposed it, when Christopher Loeb, a small-time criminal, broke into a car belonging to Burke and stole items from it, including personal items that Burke did not want to become public. Burke's response was not to report the theft and have Loeb prosecuted through normal channels. His response was to have Loeb brought to a police precinct and personally participate in his beating. Not just permit it, participate. And then, with Spota's involvement and the involvement of other senior officials, attempt to cover up what had happened, intimidating witnesses, interfering with the investigation, using the institutional authority of the police department and the district attorney's office to ensure that accountability did not arrive. Burke pleaded guilty in 2016. He was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison. Spota was convicted in 2019. A jury trial, not a plea, Spota having chosen to contest the charges. He was found guilty of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 5 years. These are not trivial offenses. These are the specific behaviors, the abuse of institutional power to protect insider interests, the suppression of accountability through intimidation and conspiracy, that define what it looks like when law enforcement institutions are corrupted from the top. And the question that the director of Gone Girls asked, and that families of the Gilgo Beach victims have been asking for years, is whether the institutional rot that Burke and Spota represented had consequences that extended beyond the Loeb case and into the Gilgo Beach investigation itself. The honest answer is, we do not know with certainty. The documented evidence does not establish a direct causal link between Burke and Spota's misconduct and specific failures in the Gilgo Beach investigation. The charges they were convicted of were about the Loeb case, not about the serial killer case. No one has gone to prison for obstructing the Gilgo Beach investigation specifically. But consider the institutional context. The investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders was at its most active and most consequential during the years when Burke and Spota were in power. The years from 2010, when the remains were found, through 2016 and 2019, when Burke and Spota were successively removed from their positions by their convictions. Those were the years when the physical evidence was freshest, when witnesses were most accessible, when investigative momentum was at its peak and the probability of making progress was highest. And during those years, the investigation produced no suspect. The institutional culture that Burke created, the culture of loyalty to insiders, of rules applying selectively, of accountability being something that happened to others, is not a culture that encourages aggressive investigation of difficult cases. It is a culture that rewards those who manage situations, who avoid embarrassments, who keep their heads down and don't create problems. Aggressive pursuit of a serial killer who had been operating for years without being identified is exactly the kind of investigation that can go wrong in ways that create embarrassment. In a culture like Burke's, the path of least resistance is not aggressive pursuit. It is managed delay. Whether any specific individual made any specific decision that delayed the Gilgo Beach investigation because of that culture, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the investigation produced no results for 12 years under the leadership of people who were, as was eventually established, running their institution in ways that had nothing to do with the public interest. Then, in 2022, everything changed. The new police commissioner formed the Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Task Force, a dedicated unit focused exclusively on this case, reporting to a new leadership structure that was not the leadership structure of the Burke era. And within 6 weeks, the task force identified Rex Heuermann. 6 weeks! It had taken 12 years under the previous regime. It took 6 weeks under the new one. That discrepancy deserves to sit. 6 weeks of focused, accountable work by a dedicated task force produced the identification that 12 years of institutional inertia had not. The mechanism was, as we noted, procedural. A vehicle registration database, a pickup truck, a query that someone had either not thought to run or not prioritized running during the 12 years before. Whether there were other leads that were similarly deprioritized or inadequately followed during those 12 years is a question that may eventually be answered, either through the cooperation process with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, or through the ongoing investigations into the unresolved aspects of the case, or through journalism and documentation that continues after the guilty plea. Now let's talk about the forensic case in detail. Because the forensic story of how Rex Heuermann was identified and prosecuted is one of the most instructive examples in recent American law enforcement of how modern investigative techniques, patient, methodical, technologically sophisticated, can close a case that has been cold for years. The starting point was the burlap. When the remains of the Gilgo Four were found in December 2010, investigators collected the materials that had been used to wrap and bind the bodies. Burlap, a coarse woven fabric commonly used in agricultural contexts for sacks and covers and a range of industrial applications. The burlap had been used consistently across multiple victims, suggesting that the perpetrator had obtained a supply of it and used it as part of a deliberate method. The burlap was evidence. It contained fibers. It contained, crucially, biological material, and specifically, a male hair, a single hair, left behind in the material used to wrap one of the victims. The hair had a root, which meant it contained nuclear DNA, the more complete and more useful form of genetic material for forensic identification. It was preserved well enough to be analyzed, and it became, for the 12 years before a suspect was identified, an unmatched profile in the database. The DNA of a man who had killed and had been careful about not leaving obvious evidence, but had not been careful enough to avoid leaving a single hair in the burlap he had used. The identification of Heuermann as a suspect in 2022 came from a different direction, the vehicle registration database and the pickup truck. But once Heuermann was identified, investigators needed to connect his DNA to the hair in the burlap. They could not compel him to provide a DNA sample without probable cause sufficient to support a court order, and they needed to get that sample without alerting him that he was under investigation. The surveillance operation that followed was carefully constructed. Investigators monitored Heuermann in Manhattan without his awareness. They documented his movements. They watched for opportunities to collect biological material he discarded in public spaces. Material that, once discarded, was legally available for collection without a warrant. He bought pizza. The brand was not reported publicly. The location was near his office in Midtown. He ate it, or some of it, and disposed of the box in a public trash can on the sidewalk. Investigators retrieved the box and sent it immediately to the crime laboratory. The lab extracted DNA from the partial crust remaining in the box, and they compared it to the profile from the hair in the burlap. The match was, in the language of forensic science, a statistically near-certain identification. The probability that two unrelated individuals would share the specific genetic profile extracted from the pizza crust and the hair in the burlap was, for all practical purposes, 0. Rex Heuermann's DNA was on the burlap used to wrap the body of one of his victims. The pizza crust had provided the sample that confirmed it. On July 13, 2023, he was arrested. The DA later described the approach of the surveillance team. They wanted the one person who mattered, the murderer, to think it was business as usual. They achieved that. He had no warning. He was taken on an ordinary workday on a Manhattan sidewalk, and whatever he had believed for 30 years about his safety and his concealment ended in that moment. The legal process that followed was prolonged and contested. His attorney, Michael Brown, challenged the DNA evidence, argued that the advanced testing techniques used to develop the profile were insufficiently established to be reliable, that the chain of custody was compromised, that the match was not as certain as prosecutors claimed. In 2025, a judge rejected those challenges. The DNA evidence was in. And with it in, the case against Heuermann for 7 counts of murder, by that point he had been charged with all 7, was overwhelming. The guilty plea on April 8, 2026, was the result of that calculus. A defendant facing overwhelming evidence, represented by counsel who understood the likely outcome of a trial, making the decision that pleading guilty was preferable to what a jury would almost certainly do. Heuermann's own lawyer said afterward that he hoped the plea would provide some peace and closure to the victims' families. He said his client wanted to spare them the ordeal of a trial. He said he expected Heuermann to speak at the sentencing hearing. Whether the stated motivations for the plea are accurate is impossible to verify. What is accurate is the outcome. 8 families received the word they had been waiting for, some of them for 30 years, some for more than 2 decades. The word was given in person, by the man who had taken everything from them, in a room that held everyone who had a stake in this moment. The district attorney said afterward he thought that by killing them he could silence them forever and get away with murder. But he was wrong, because it was these victims, these women, who refused to stay silent. The women refused to stay silent. Their DNA was on the burlap. Their remains were found along Ocean Parkway. Their families filed missing persons reports and held press conferences and waded through 12 years of inadequate investigation and never stopped asking where their daughters and sisters were. Their cases attracted journalists and authors and documentary makers who kept the story alive during the years when the official investigation was not moving. Robert Kolker wrote Lost Girls in 2013 and gave Melissa Barthelemy and Megan Waterman and Amber Costello and Maureen Brainard-Barnes their full stories. Not as victims, but as people, with childhoods and ambitions and families and futures that had been taken from them. That book mattered. That kind of work matters. It keeps the cases alive when institutions are failing them. The women were found, and now the man who tried to make them disappear has said the word their families needed to hear. Now, what remains unresolved? The question of additional victims is not academic. The plea deal specifically preserved prosecutors' ability to bring new charges if additional victims are linked to Heuermann. That language is in the agreement for a reason. Investigators believe the 8 admitted murders may not represent the full scope of what Heuermann did. The geography of the known victims, the Hamptons, Fire Island, Ocean Parkway, Manorville, suggests someone who was mobile, who disposed of victims across a wide area, who may have been active in more ways and more places than the confirmed cases establish. Asian Doe remains unidentified. The remains of an individual found near Gilgo Beach, whose identity has not been established, whose death has not been attributed to any known perpetrator. Heuermann's attorney says his client has nothing to do with Asian Doe. That denial is now on the record. Whether it is accurate is a separate question that the ongoing investigation will need to answer. Shannon Gilbert remains officially an accidental drowning. The circumstances of her death, the 911 call in which she said she was being chased, her disappearance from a client's home, her remains found in a marshy area miles from the primary cluster, have never been fully explained in a way that satisfies her family or all of the investigators who have examined the case. The medical examiner's ruling stands. The The question of whether that ruling is correct and whether someone is responsible for what happened to Shannon Gilbert in May 2010 remains open. The cooperation agreement with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is significant not just for what it may reveal about Heuermann's specific crimes, but for what it may contribute to the broader understanding of how predators of this type operate. The BAU, the unit that pioneered criminal profiling, that has studied hundreds of serial offenders, will have direct access to a man who maintained a double life for 3 decades in one of the most densely observed metropolitan areas in the world. What he tells them about selection, concealment, compulsion, and the specific mechanics of long-term predatory behavior will be incorporated into a body of knowledge that informs investigations for years to come. And the sentencing hearing on June 17th is the moment when the families speak. Not as observers, not as people waiting for the process to produce an outcome, but as participants in the final formal act of accountability. They will deliver victim impact statements. They will say the names of the women they loved in a context that is not charges or pleas or legal argument, but grief. The specific, articulate grief of people who have waited decades for the chance to say publicly what this cost, what it meant, what was taken. Rex Heuermann will be sentenced to life in prison without parole. He will never leave. The cooperation agreement will play out across whatever years remain to him in ways that investigators and the public will not fully know, because the FBI does not publicize the contents of cooperation sessions with convicted killers. But the knowledge will be used. The names of the women will be in that room on June 17th, and the architect from Massapequa Park, who believed for 30 years that he was invisible, will spend the rest of his life in a cell, knowing that it was a pizza box on a Manhattan sidewalk that made him visible. That is the story of what happened. But the larger story, the story of why it took so long, the story of what happens when institutions fail the people they are supposed to serve, the story of who gets taken seriously as a victim and who doesn't, that story did not end with the guilty plea. It is the story of every case in which a predator calculated that certain victims would not be missed and turned out to be right for a time. It is the story of every investigation in which institutional culture made slow inaction more comfortable than aggressive pursuit. It is the story of every family that filed a missing persons report and waited years for a response that should have taken days. The author Robert Kolker said it in 2013, and it remains true today. The killer chose his victims because he thought they wouldn't be missed. He was not wrong about the institutional landscape in which he was operating. He was wrong eventually because the institutional landscape changed, because a new task force was formed, because the truck description was run through a database, because investigators in Manhattan watched a man buy pizza on a sidewalk and acted on what they saw. He was wrong, but 30 years is a long time to be wrong. The sentencing is June 17th. The names will be spoken: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costilla, Valerie Mack, Karen Vergata. We will be here. Hit the like button. Subscribe to Forensic Disconnect. Drop a comment. What do you think about the guilty plea? What questions do you believe remain unanswered? And do you think the institutional corruption in Suffolk County directly affected this investigation? We read every single comment. The sentencing is June 17th. We will cover it. The names will be spoken again. Let's go deeper into the lives of each of these women. Because the risk with cases like this, cases that generate years of coverage, that become cultural touchstones, that produce documentaries and films and podcasts, is that the victims become symbols rather than people, that the names become part of a list rather than part of a life, that the gravity of what happened to them gets absorbed into the narrative of the investigation, into the story of how the killer was caught, rather than remaining where it belongs, in the specific, irreplaceable particularity of each woman who was taken. Melissa Barthelemy was born in 1985 in the Buffalo area of upstate New York. She had a younger sister. By the time she was in her early 20s, she had moved to New York City, the same move that thousands of young people from smaller cities and towns make every year, the move toward opportunity and anonymity and the particular energy of a place that does not ask where you came from. She was 24 years old when she disappeared in July 2009. Her family reported her missing. The case was opened. And then, in the days that followed her disappearance, her younger sister began receiving phone calls. The calls came from a burner phone. The person on the other end of the line was a man. He described, in terms that were explicit and designed to cause maximum distress, what had happened to Melissa. He called a teenage girl who was looking for her missing sister and told her what had been done to that sister. Multiple times, over multiple days. Those calls were among the most disturbing elements of the Heuermann case when they became public after his arrest. They were not made in a moment of panic or impulse. They were deliberate. They required Heuermann to have obtained the sister's phone number, to have purchased a burner phone specifically for this purpose, to have made the decision to call, and to have followed through on that decision repeatedly. They suggest a psychology in which the act of violence was not the culmination, but the beginning of an extended engagement with its consequences, in which the suffering of the people left behind was itself something to be sought and prolonged. Investigators eventually matched the burner phone used for those calls to cell towers near Heuermann's home in Massapequa Park and to locations he traveled to regularly. The calls became part of the case. The calls were evidence. Melissa Barthelemy's remains were among the first found at Gilgo Beach in December 2010. She had been there in the brush along Ocean Parkway for more than a year. Megan Waterman was born in 1988 in Maine. She grew up in Scarborough, a town south of Portland on the coast. She had a young daughter. By 2010, she was 22 years old and had traveled to Long Island for work. She was reported missing in June 2010. Her mother, Lorraine Ella, became one of the most visible advocates for the Gilgo Beach victims in the years that followed, attending press conferences, speaking to journalists, appearing in documentaries, maintaining a presence that kept Megan's name in the public record through years of investigative stagnation. Lorraine Ella was in the courtroom on April 8th when Heuermann said the word. She had been waiting since 2010. Megan Waterman's remains were found at Gilgo Beach in December 2010, alongside the other 3 members of the Gilgo Four. She had been there for 6 months. Amber Lynn Costello was 27 years old when she disappeared in September 2010. She was from Bayshore, Long Island, not far from Gilgo Beach, not far from Massapequa Park, in the geography of Long Island's South Shore that Heuermann knew well. She was reported missing, and a witness in the vicinity of where she was last seen reported seeing a pickup truck. That detail sat in the investigative file for 12 years. When the new task force ran it through the vehicle registration database in 2022, the trail that had been cold for over a decade began to move. It was Amber Costello's case that led directly to Rex Heuermann's identification. In that specific sense, she is the one whose case produced the thread that pulled everything apart. Her remains were found at Gilgo Beach in December 2010, 6 weeks after her disappearance. Maureen Brainard-Barnes was 25 years old when she disappeared in July 2007. She was the earliest of the Gilgo Four to go missing. She was from Norwich, Connecticut, and had been working in New York. She had a young son. She was reported missing in 2007, and her case was open for more than 3 years before her remains were found at Gilgo Beach in December 2010. Her sister Melissa Cann spent the years that followed as one of the case's most vocal public advocates. On April 8, 2026, 19 years after Maureen disappeared, Melissa Cann said in a courtroom in Riverhead that this had been a long journey of hope. 19 years of hope, 19 years of advocacy, 19 years of waiting for the word. Jessica Taylor was 20 years old when she disappeared in 2003. She was from Queens, New York, and had been living in Manhattan. She was 20 years old. Some of her remains were found in Manorville, Long Island, in 2003, in a wooded area more than 40 miles from Gilgo Beach, and additional remains were found at Gilgo Beach in 2011. The geographic dispersion of her remains was one of the details that complicated investigators' understanding of the case for years, because it suggested either movement or dismemberment, or both, and raised questions about the relationship between the Manorville findings and the Ocean Parkway cluster that were not definitively answered until Heuermann's identification made the connection clear. Elizabeth Botskill, Jessica Taylor's mother, waited from 2003. 23 years. From the time her daughter disappeared in 2003 to the moment Rex Heuermann said guilty in April 2026. 23 years. When she spoke to reporters after the guilty plea, she said, "I am glad that this is over. I am glad that this is over. The repetition is everything." The repetition is what 23 years of waiting sounds like when it is finally, imperfectly, inadequately resolved. Sandra Costilla was in her late 20s when she was killed in November 1993. She was Heuermann's first victim by the timeline established in the guilty plea. Her remains were found in Southampton, the Hamptons, more than 60 miles east of Gilgo Beach, and her case was open for decades before investigators connected her to the Ocean Parkway cluster and ultimately to Rex Heuermann. She was first to die and last to be formally connected. She waited the longest for her case to be resolved, in the sense that the institutional connection between her death and the investigation that eventually produced accountability was the last to be established. Her name was added to the charges against Heuermann in June 2024, more than 30 years after she was killed. Valerie Mack was 24 years old when she disappeared in 2000. She had been reported missing under a different name. Her remains were found in 2 separate locations, at Manorville in 2000 and additional remains at Gilgo Beach in 2011. Like Jessica Taylor, the dispersion of her remains across multiple sites confused the case for years. She was identified, and her connection to the Gilgo Beach cluster established only after the investigation had developed sufficiently to make those connections. She was charged to Heuermann in December 2024, more than 24 years after she disappeared. Karen Vergata disappeared in 1996. She was in her 30s. Her remains were found on Fire Island in 1996 and were known for most of the following 3 decades as Fire Island Jane Doe. Her identity was established only in recent years. She was never formally charged to Heuermann. He admitted her killing voluntarily as part of the plea agreement in exchange for confirmation that no further charges would be brought in connection with the 8 murders he was admitting to. She was the 8th. She had been gone for 30 years. 8 women. 8 lives that were taken by a man who chose them because he calculated that they were vulnerable and that the institutions around them would not pursue their cases with full urgency. He was not entirely wrong about that calculation. He was wrong, ultimately, because the institutions changed, because a task force was formed, because a database was queried, because a pizza box was retrieved from a Manhattan trash can. But the calculation was not baseless. And the fact that it had any basis at all is the larger indictment that this case leaves behind. Expanded section. The forensic story in full. Let's go deeper into the forensic investigation. Because the story of how Rex Heuermann was identified, surveilled, and ultimately connected to the crimes is one of the most instructive examples of modern investigative technique in recent American law enforcement. And it is also, in the specific detail of how the DNA evidence was developed, a story about patience and method and the kind of careful, accountable work that the previous 12 years had not produced. The burlap. Let's start there. When the remains of the Gilgo Four were recovered in December 2010, investigators collected everything associated with the bodies. The burlap that had been used to wrap them was carefully preserved and sent to the laboratory. Burlap, a coarse woven fabric made from jute or similar plant fibers, commonly used in agricultural and industrial contexts, was not a material that immediately pointed to a specific source or a specific individual. It is widely available. It is used on farms, in gardens, in construction, in dozens of ordinary contexts. Its presence told investigators something about method and deliberateness. The use of burlap across multiple victims suggested a supply, a pattern, a premeditated approach rather than an improvised response, but it did not immediately point to a name. What it did contain, once the laboratory examined it closely, was a male hair, a single hair with an intact root. The root is critical in forensic hair analysis because it contains nuclear DNA, the complete genetic code, as opposed to the mitochondrial DNA found in the hair shaft, which is less specific and less useful for individual identification. The hair had been left in the burlap, left behind, inadvertently, in the material used to wrap one of the victims. It survived the elements. It was collected. It was preserved. And it was processed into a DNA profile that represented, for 12 years, an unmatched entry in the investigative database, the genetic signature of a man who had not yet been identified. That profile was run against CODIS, the National DNA Identification Database, and produced no match. This is not unusual. CODIS contains the profiles of convicted offenders and of individuals who have been processed through the criminal justice system in ways that result in DNA collection. Rex Heuermann had no prior criminal record. His DNA was not in CODIS. The unmatched profile sat in the investigative database waiting. When the new task force identified Heuermann in 2022 through the vehicle registration database and the pickup truck, they had a suspect, but not a confirmed DNA connection. They needed to get a sample of Heuermann's DNA to compare against the profile from the burlap. And they needed to do it without alerting him that he was under investigation, because the moment he knew investigators were looking at him, the risk of evidence being destroyed or behavior being altered increased significantly. The surveillance operation in Manhattan was designed to create the opportunity for a legal, covert DNA collection. Investigators followed Heuermann in the city. They watched his habits. They documented where he went and what he did. They were looking for any moment when he discarded biological material in a public space, because biological material discarded in public is not protected by Fourth Amendment privacy expectations and can be legally collected without a warrant. The pizza presented that opportunity. He bought it. He ate part of it. He disposed of the box in a public trash can. The moment the box hit the trash, investigators moved to retrieve it before it could be collected with the rest of the city's garbage. The box went to the laboratory. The partial crust remaining in the box was processed for DNA, and the profile extracted from the pizza crust was compared to the unmatched profile from the hair in the burlap. The match was, in forensic statistical terms, essentially certain. The probability of the match occurring by chance, of two unrelated individuals sharing this specific genetic profile, was vanishingly small. For all practical purposes, the DNA on the pizza crust and the DNA in the burlap came from the same person. Rex Heuermann had left his genetic signature at the crime scene in the material he had used to wrap one of his victims 30 years before investigators connected it to him. The pizza crust closed the loop. After the match was confirmed, investigators had the probable cause necessary to obtain a court-ordered DNA sample directly from Heuermann, a cheek swab, administered after his arrest. That sample confirmed the match from the pizza crust. The forensic case was complete. Advanced DNA testing techniques played a role in the development of the profile from the burlap hair as well. The techniques used were, as Heuermann's defense attorney argued in his motion to exclude the evidence, more recently developed than the standard methods used in many criminal prosecutions. The judge who heard that motion rejected the defense's argument, found that the techniques were sufficiently established and reliable to be admitted as evidence. That ruling was critical. Without the DNA evidence, the case against Heuermann was strong circumstantially, but not overwhelming. With it, the case was unassailable. The cell phone evidence developed alongside the DNA. Investigators traced the burner phones that Heuermann had used to contact the victims before their disappearances and to make the calls to Melissa Barthelemy's sister afterward. Burner phones, prepaid devices purchased with cash or anonymized payment, are a common tool of people trying to conduct communications without creating a traceable record. They are also, when analyzed through cell tower data and call records, traceable in ways that many of their users do not fully understand. Cell towers record which device is connected to them and when. When a burner phone makes a call, it connects to the nearest tower. The tower records the connection. If the burner phone makes calls from locations that are consistently associated with a specific individual, from the neighborhood where they live, from the routes they travel regularly, from the areas they frequent, those records can establish a pattern that connects the anonymous phone to a specific person. Heuermann's burner phones made calls from locations that were consistent with his known movements: his neighborhood in Massapequa Park, the routes between Massapequa Park and Manhattan, the areas he traveled for work. The pattern was documented and became part of the case. The internet search history was developed through the investigation of Heuermann's devices after his arrest. What investigators found was a record of obsessive attention to the Gilgo Beach case: searches for news coverage, searches for investigative developments, searches for information about specific victims and specific aspects of the investigation. The breadth and depth of those searches, maintained over years, was consistent with the behavior pattern that forensic psychologists associate with certain types of offenders who monitor investigations into their own crimes, a behavior that serves multiple functions, including intelligence gathering about what investigators know, and the psychological satisfaction of following the consequences of crimes already committed. The document that the prosecution described as a blueprint, found in Heuermann's possession, detailed his methodology in ways that investigators found both instructive and disturbing. The specifics of what was in that document have not been fully disclosed publicly because the details remain part of an ongoing investigation into potential additional victims. But its existence and its contents, to the extent they have been described in court and in reporting, are consistent with the profile of an organized, deliberate offender who had thought systematically about what he was doing and had documented his thinking. The case that prosecutors assembled from all of these elements, the DNA, the cell phone records, the internet history, the vehicle registration, the surveillance, the behavioral documentation, was comprehensive. It was the kind of case that, when a judge admits the DNA evidence and the defense's exclusion arguments fail, leaves a defendant with very limited realistic options at trial. The decision to plead guilty, whatever its stated motivations, was a rational response to an overwhelming evidentiary situation. Expanded section: The unanswered questions and what June 17th means. Let's talk about what happens now. Because the guilty plea, while it delivers the accountability that 8 families waited decades for, does not close this case entirely. It closes the chapter that covers the 8 admitted murders. It does not close the questions that surround them. The cooperation agreement with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is perhaps the most consequential element of the plea deal for the broader public interest. The BAU, established in the 1970s, made famous by the work of investigators like Robert Ressler and John Douglas, the unit that pioneered the systematic study of violent criminal behavior, will have direct, sustained access to Rex Heuermann. They will be able to ask him questions that no one outside that room will be able to ask. They will be able to explore in detail the specific mechanics of how he operated for 17 years without being caught, how he selected victims, how he maintained concealment, how he managed the psychological weight of what he was doing alongside the ordinary obligations of his professional and domestic life. Whatever he tells them will not be public. The contents of cooperation sessions with convicted killers are not disclosed, but the knowledge will be used, incorporated into the analytical frameworks that inform how investigators approach similar cases, how behavioral profiles are constructed, how the specific type of organized predator that Rex Heuermann represents is identified and investigated. That knowledge could contribute to the resolution of other cases, cases that are currently cold, cases where investigators have a profile but no name, cases where someone has been operating the way Heuermann operated and has not yet been found. In that sense, the guilty plea has a reach that extends beyond the 8 families in the courtroom in Riverhead on April 8th. It reaches into every cold case that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is currently working, and every case that will eventually be brought to them. The knowledge that Heuermann carries, about the specific architecture of long-term concealment, about the specific vulnerabilities that allowed him to operate, is not merely historical. It is operationally relevant, and the cooperation agreement ensures that it will be used. The sentencing on June 17th will be the final formal act in the legal process. The judge will receive a pre-sentence report, a comprehensive document prepared by the court's probation office that covers Heuermann's background, the facts of the offenses, and the arguments of both sides about the appropriate sentence. The prosecution and the defense will each have the opportunity to make sentencing arguments, and the victims' families will speak. The victim impact statements at a sentencing hearing of this magnitude are not pro forma. They are the moment when the legal process, which has necessarily been about evidence and procedure and statutory language, becomes explicitly about the human cost of what happened. When Elizabeth Batskill speaks about what it meant to wait 23 years. When Melissa Cann speaks about Maureen. When the families of Sandra Costilla and Karen Vergata and Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor and Melissa Barthelemy and Megan Waterman and Amber Costello speak their names and say what was taken, the courtroom becomes something other than a legal proceeding. It becomes a record of consequences, a record of what the crimes of one man cost the people who loved 8 women. Rex Heuermann will be sentenced to life without parole. 3 consecutive life sentences, followed by 4 sentences of 25 years to life. He will never leave prison. He will die in prison. Whatever the cooperation process produces, whatever he tells the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, whatever years remain to him, they will be spent in a cell. The architecture of ordinary life that concealed him for 30 years, the commute, the office, the suburban home, is gone. What remains is a cell and a record and 8 names. The women refused to stay silent. The hair in the burlap was evidence. The pizza box on the Manhattan sidewalk was evidence. The cell phone records were evidence. The 30 years of concealment were not enough. June 17th, the names will be spoken. We will be here.